So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Anila DeMello as speaker for this month's Topic in Rehab Sciences seminar. Dr. DeMello completed her BA in psychology at Georgetown University, went on to do a PhD in behavior, cognition, and neuroscience at American University, also in DC. She completed her postdoctoral training at the McGovern Institute for Brain Research at MIT. And currently, she is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry in the O'Donnell Brain Institute at the University of Texas Southwestern. And she's an additional appointment, and she's joining us today from the Department of Psychology at UT Dallas. So her research combines tools from fields like cognitive neuroscience, psychology, and developmental psychology to study and gain a better understanding of mechanisms in the human brain that support language and cognition. I had the pleasure of meeting Anila recently at a meeting that was focused on the cerebellum, and I thought that her work on studying cerebrocerebellar circuits in cognition and language was really great, really innovative and interesting, and I thought people here would agree. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Anila. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. So talking to you today about cerebellar contributions to human cognition, and very grateful for the support of Nancy and Marc Shrier. Okay, I have no financial disclosures. I will disclose that my voice is kind of on the edge, so hopefully I will make it through the presentation. But other than that, nothing to disclose. And so the objectives for today are really to gain a broader understanding of cerebellar contributions to higher order cognition and disorders, so beyond the role of the cerebellum in motor behaviors, gain familiarity with cerebellar functional organization in humans, and then, of course, understand the importance of including the cerebellum in human neuroimaging studies and clinical investigations. Okay, so today I really want to talk to you about the cerebellum and its role in cognition. And this is maybe slightly different than what people are used to. We know that the cerebellum is really involved in motor behaviors, but it turns out that the cerebellum is involved in much more. And in addition to its role in normal cognition, I want to talk to you about how differences in cerebrocerebellar circuits might be related to cognitive issues in certain disorders like autism. And today I want to focus on some of my research on language in particular, language and social communication. And this is because language is a really unique challenge. Language draws on both sensory and motor systems of the brain. It's used to interact with others socially, and it changes vastly across the course of development. So this makes it really challenging to study. And what I hope to be able to convince you by the end of the day is that the cerebellum might actually be the ugly duckling of the brain. So it's different than other brain regions. And so because of this difference, it's often excluded from neuroimaging or clinical investigations. It's largely neglected in our frameworks and theories about language and cognition, but maybe it's actually beautiful and it's just misunderstood. And so hopefully I will convince you of that today. Now, of course, this isn't a fairy tale. This is real life and it's an actual problem. So just to give you a sense of the scale of this problem, I want to show you some PubMed searches using the terms cerebellum versus cerebral cortex. As you can see, the cerebellum gets only about 18% of these search results as compared to the cerebral cortex. And this is fascinating because it's actually in direct opposition to the physical organization of the brain. It turns out that only 20% of neurons in the brain are located in the cerebral cortex versus about 80% of the neurons in the brain, which are located in the cerebellum. And so my goal today is to answer a few questions for you. So first is the question, beyond its role in motor behaviors, is the cerebellum involved in something greater, in something like higher order language and cognition? And if so, what is the impact then of cerebellar differences in disorders of language and cognition? And I'll focus here on autism. And lastly, what is it that the cerebellum is actually doing and how does it do it? So how is it organized to do these kinds of things? And so I'll start with this first question. Okay, so to do that, I want to give you a bit of a primer on the cerebellum at the level of analysis that I'll be using during the talk. So the cerebellum is this structure here at the back of the brain. It's subdivided into a number of lobes, which are further subdivided into lobules, and they're numbered here for you. And each of these areas is connected via a series of these reciprocal closed loop circuits with the contralateral cerebral cortex. So the right cerebellum is connected to the left cerebral cortex and vice versa. And we know from electrophysiology and plenty of animal work and human work that the cerebellum contains within it representations of the body, so motor somatotopy. But as I told you, the cerebellum also contains 80% of the neurons in the brain and even close to 50% of the neurons in the central nervous system. So it's likely that it's doing something beyond just motor behavior. And it wasn't really until the advent of neuroimaging that we realized that yes, while these motor regions of the cerebellum were functionally and anatomically connected to somatomotor regions of the cerebral cortex, marked here in blue, that actually the vast majority of the cerebellum is functionally and anatomically connected to non-motor association cortices of the human brain, important for thought and language and executive function and planning. And this is primarily true of these large posterolateral hemispheres of the cerebellum, including regions like crus 1 and crus 2, which you'll hear me talk about today. And these regions have expanded in time along with the expansion of the prefrontal cortex in phylogenetically newer species. And so this obviously challenges canonical ideas about the cerebellum and what it does. And neuroimaging has also shown that, in fact, individual regions within the cerebellum support different kinds of cognitive functions. And so there's this functional topography that's evident not only at the group level, but also at the level of individual subjects. And over time, this functional topography has evolved to become incredibly specific about the kinds of functions that can be represented within the cerebellum. Now, for the purposes of this talk and language, I just want to draw your attention to the striking amount of cerebellum that's actually devoted to things like linguistic processing. And this is interesting because it's thought to be the domain of left hemisphere cortical regions, usually. This is also interesting because when it comes to theoretical models of language and cognition, they suggest that the cerebellum plays hardly any role, or if it does play a role, it plays a very lowly role. So in really influential language models, the cerebellum is placed at this really low articulatory level, but it doesn't contribute to things like comprehension or semantics, which are higher order. And it turns out that clinical evidence actually contradicts this. So patients with damage to the cerebellum have several higher order deficits, including deficits in working memory, reading, comprehension, and more. And so, in fact, another challenge to this canonical idea about the cerebellum as a motor structure comes from these patient studies. So while damage to regions of the cerebellum that are motor in nature, like the anterior lobe in the cerebellum, do result in motor issues like ataxia or dysarthria or articulation problems, damage to non-motor regions of the cerebellum actually can result in non-motor language difficulties, like naming difficulties, in the absence of any motor issues at all. And so this was really interesting to me. And so one goal of my research has really been to examine what are cerebellar contributions to language, and primarily what is the cerebellum's role in the most complex aspects of language, things like understanding meaning or semantic processing. And so one way to do this, a really simple way to do this, is to look at a sentence completion task. So in this task, participants in the scanner have to make a judgment about what word best completes a sentence. So they see these words one after the other, and they have to decide what word best completes this sentence. So clearly this involves understanding the previous words in the sentence. And of course, when we do this kind of task in the scanner, we see great left hemisphere language network activation in regions that we know are involved in understanding meaning. But we also saw equally strong activation within the cerebellum. And this activation was primarily in right lateralized regions of the cerebellum, including crus 1 and crus 2. And these are regions of the cerebellum that connect contralaterally to several of these left hemisphere language regions. Okay, so that was interesting to us. But it turns out that the cerebellum is not only involved in these kind of sentence completion tasks, but also involved in even more complex semantic processing. For example, in judgments of semantic plausibility. So what does that mean? So here, participants are asked in the scanner to read a sentence and determine whether or not the sentence is semantically plausible or implausible, when both of these sentences are actually grammatically correct. So this is a really complex and subtle manipulation. And it turns out that the cerebellum is very involved in doing things like this. And not only did we find that the cerebellum was involved in judgments of semantic plausibility, but actually cerebellar activation patterns could differentiate plausible from implausible sentences. And these activation patterns change as cognitive demands grew. So if participants were asked to read the sentence really, really fast, cerebellar activation patterns were very, very high. And so it turned out that the cerebellum really kicked into gear when participants had to decide very quickly whether or not a sentence was semantically plausible at the most challenging reading speeds for humans. And so we thought, well, maybe the cerebellum is quickly devoting resources to scaffold comprehension when cognitive demands are really high. And what we found was that, in fact, in individuals who were able to maintain really high levels of cerebellar activation, even when these sentences were being presented at very challenging speeds, these individuals were actually better at these judgments of semantic plausibility. So they were actually more accurate. Okay, so these kinds of skills might be related to other domains, for example, reading. In the case of reading, skilled performance depends on the development of something called automaticity. And this is rapid or effortless, accurate word reading or decoding. And what reading automaticity does is it allows you to quickly understand a word and dedicate cognitive resources to complex things like comprehension. And what we found was that individuals who, again, were able to maintain high levels of cerebellar activation at the most challenging reading speeds were the same individuals who are actually the most fluent and automatic readers outside of the scanner. Okay, so it seems like the cerebellum is definitely playing some sort of role in higher language comprehension, higher level language comprehension. So what about other higher order cognitive domains? Language often goes hand in hand with things like social interaction, and it's actually very important for social interaction. This is another very high level domain. And so we wanted to assess whether the cerebellum was also important in these kind of higher order domains of social learning. And so to do this, we put participants in the scanner and we had them do this interesting task called the cyberball task, where participants throw a ball back and forth to other people who they believe are real people, but they aren't. Now, over the course of the task, there emerges distinct player profiles, whereby one player emerges as a good player who often throws the ball back and forth to the participant, and the other player is a bad player who stops throwing the ball as often to the participant. And participants are really good at quickly learning who these people are. And over the course of the task, they learn to throw more balls to the good player and less balls to the bad player. And what we found is that better learning on this task was associated with greater activation in the cerebellum. Again, these kind of right crus 1, crus 2 regions, along with other regions that we know are important for things like learning and memory, like the hippocampus. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that the cerebellum clearly does something in the absence of any kind of motor demand for language and cognition, especially at these very high levels. And so one question then is, what is the impact of cerebellar differences in disorders where these kinds of higher order language and cognitive domains are affected? And it turns out that cerebellar differences are pretty common in several neurodevelopmental and psychiatric disorders. And this includes things like dyslexia, psychosis, schizophrenia, ADHD, and of particular interest to me in autism spectrum disorder. And so for those of you that might not be familiar, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it's primarily characterized by two pillars: the presence of persistent deficits in social communication and interaction, and the presence of restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior. And language actually can contribute, or difficulties with language can contribute in different ways to both of these kind of core diagnostic pillars. And that makes language a really important thing to study in autism. Now, what's striking is that it turns out that the cerebellum is one of the most consistent sites of abnormality in autism spectrum disorder. And this is across animal models, neuroimaging, postmortem studies, across the board. And just to give you a sense of this, if we look at the probability of diagnosis in individuals with autism, what we see is that cerebellar injury at birth is associated with a huge increase in the probability that someone will get a diagnosis of autism later in life, more so than having, for example, an autistic fraternal twin. Okay, so it's understood that the cerebellum is involved in language now. It seems that it plays its critical role in autism, but a natural question not addressed by the literature up until this point was whether the function and structure of the cerebellum was related to things like language acquisition in autistic children. And so to address this, we looked at structure in the cerebellum. And we looked at how differences in structure in the cerebellum related to language acquisition. And what we found was that the cerebellum was one of the only region where decreased gray matter, primarily in these right hemispheres, was associated with later age of language acquisition. No other place in the brain showed this relationship. And beyond things like language acquisition, we also found that reduced gray matter in the cerebellum was associated with other autistic symptomologies. For example, that decreased structure, again in crus 1 and crus 2 of the cerebellum, correlated with the degree of challenges in social interaction that autistic children were exhibiting. And beyond things like language and social interaction, we found that decreased gray matter converging in this right crus 1 region of the cerebellum was associated with increased challenges in all core diagnostic domains of autism, from social interaction to communication to also repetitive behaviors. So this kind of convergence was really striking to us. And to figure out what exactly this region was doing, we partnered with an animal group to try and understand with better control, more invasive control, what this region was doing. And so what we were able to do along with this animal group was to modulate right crus 1 specifically of the cerebellum in mice and see what happened, observe what happened to social approach behaviors. So typically, mice placed into this chamber will spend a lot more time investigating a novel animal that's placed in their environment than a novel object. Interestingly, inhibiting right crus 1 of the cerebellum eliminates or abolishes this kind of normal social approach behavior. And when we looked at what kind of circuits were responsible for this kind of difference, what we found was that reduced firing in right crus 1 of the cerebellum was associated with an abnormal increase in firing in the contralateral parietal lobe. And these regions of the parietal cortex that we found, we know are important for things like social interaction and communication in humans. And so we turned to a large group of autistic children and neurotypical children. And what we found was this same circuit that we found to be abnormal in mice was also abnormally increased in its functional connectivity in children, in autistic children. Now, the nice thing about mouse models is that not only can you inhibit a certain region, but you can also stimulate that region. And so what our collaborators did was they took a mouse model of autism, the tuberous sclerosis 1 mouse model. And in this mouse model of autism, they found reduced cerebellar volume in right crus 1, along with increased parietal volume in several of the regions that we had identified prior. This mouse typically shows abnormal social approach behaviors, but stimulation of right crus 1 results in a rescue of these social approach behaviors even later in life, even into adulthood. Now, what was interesting is we found very similar results in autistic children. We found that reduced cerebellar volume and increased parietal volume was associated with language delays, and that non-invasive neuromodulation in neurotypical adults can actually decrease cerebelloparietal connectivity in this circuit that we find to be abnormally increased in autistic children. Okay, so I just want to pause here for a second because I think it's really important to say that, first of all, there's no such thing as an autistic mouse, and mice and humans are not the same. And so my goal here is not to say, we can fix autism by doing these things, but we do think that this kind of approach can elucidate these basic brain behavior mechanisms that are important for basic science. And in addition, it's important to note that autism is characterized both by several challenges, but also by specific strengths. And this is an active area of research for us. There's several areas, there's a lot of evidence that several of the things that we view as deficits in autism can also be seen as strengths in certain contexts. And that can be related to differences in the brain, including cerebellar differences. And so just to keep that in mind as we're talking about mice and men. Okay, so back to the scheduled talk. Okay, so at this point, it's kind of clear, okay, cerebellum's doing something special. It might be very crucial in disorders like autism. And so a specific question now is, excuse me, my life blow my nose. What is it that the cerebellum is doing for language and cognition, and how is it organized to do this? Okay, so in the motor domain, it turns out that the cerebellum is very well studied, and that the cerebellum houses sensory motor internal models. And these are essentially representations of the sensory consequences of our actions. And so they allow us to move without having to wait for sensory feedback, which is by definition delayed, and adjust our movements in real time. So we can predict what the sensory feedback of these motions is going to be. If we make a movement that results in sensory feedback that doesn't match our original predictions, we can actually update our model based on these prediction errors and more precisely calibrate our motion next time. Now, in neuroimaging studies, we know that sensory predictions are represented very focally in the cerebellum, and sensory prediction errors are represented with widespread swaths of activation that are thought to be important for suppressing all the actions that we took that might have initially led to that error in the first place. What's fascinating about the cerebellum is that unlike other regions of the brain, the cytoarchitecture of the cerebellum and the circuitry within the cerebellum is completely uniform. So coupled with this idea of sensory internal and sensory motor internal models, this idea of uniform cytoarchitecture has led to several theories that suggest that maybe the cerebellum is also implementing internal models for cognition. And that might allow us to predict what someone is going to say next in the context of a conversation, but also code a prediction error and update our representations of these conversations in the case that what is said in conversation is not what we had predicted. Okay. And so we've tested this in several ways, and I'll show you one. This again is a sentence completion task. So participants are in the scanner and they read words that come up one at a time on the screen and choose which word best completes the sentence. And what we can do is we can modulate how predictive the sentence context is before asking participants to make a decision about the final word. So we can make these sentences highly predictive, like 2 + 2 is 4, or we can make them kind of nonsensical and error ridden. And what we find is that semantic predictions are represented more focally in regions of the cerebellum that are important for language. As sentences get more and more predictive, the level of activation gets more and more focal. And similarly to sensory motor prediction errors, semantic prediction errors, when sentences don't make sense, activate wide swaths of cerebellar language regions. Okay, so one problem with fMRI is that it is correlative in nature. And so a question then is the cerebellum actually causally involved in several of these mechanisms? And so to test this, what we've done is turn to non-invasive neuromodulation. And in particular, we've used transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS. And so this is a technique that allows you to modulate resting membrane potential under the site of electrodes that are placed on the scalp. And so you place these electrodes on the scalp and you run current through them. And depending on the placement of electrodes, you can have polarity specific effects, either anodal, which temporarily depolarizes resting membrane potential, so makes an area more likely to fire, or the opposite with cathodal. And in addition to using TDCS, we can actually combine TDCS with fMRI. So we can do it in the scanner to not only see how cerebellar neuromodulation affects behavior, but also to look at how it affects the brain. And so what we find is that neuromodulation of the cerebellum, and primarily of right crest 1 of the cerebellum, makes people better at things like sentence completion accuracy and semantic fluency. So for example, how many words in a specific category you can come up with. And what's important to note is this is only true of TDCS to cognitive regions of the cerebellum. TDCS to motor regions of the cerebellum doesn't have these same facilitative effects. At the level of the brain, we find that TDCS to right crest 1 of the cerebellum increases activation in cerebrocerebellar language regions specifically. So not just randomly across the brain, but specifically to language regions. And that this activation increases are greatest when some sort of predictive processing is necessary. So some sort of state-dependent neuromodulation. And we can also look at connections between language regions of the brain. And we find that TDCS to right crest 1 of the cerebellum increases connectivity within the language network of the brain. So now in the past, I've shown you, okay, we know cerebellum is doing something in language, but it's also important potentially in social learning. So we've repeated these kinds of analyses on these TDCS analyses on this social learning task. And just to remind you, participants are generally really good at differentiating good from bad players. But following cerebellar TDCS, what we find is that participants are impaired all of a sudden. These are neurotypical participants are impaired all of a sudden in their ability to learn from past experience to ultimately differentiate fair from unfair players. And not only does it affect their actual performance, it also affects their subjective trust and preference ratings of the other players that they play with. So I think this is interesting because several theoretical frameworks of autism also implicate things like challenges in predictive processing or using past experience to guide future behaviors. And it might be that the cerebellum then is optimally located for some of these challenges in autism. Or differences in the cerebellum might relate to some of these challenges in autism. And we have some very, very preliminary data that might speak to this. So again, this is a really small sample of neurotypical and autistic adults. What we find is that activation in these right crest 1 regions of the cerebellum is highest in neurotypical individuals when they're learning these social contingencies. So who should I throw to? Who's the good player? Who's the bad player? In a small group of autistic individuals, we find no evidence of that activation. But following neuromodulation of the cerebellum in autistic individuals, we find some sort of increased activation here and also improved behavioral performance on this ball toss social learning task. Okay, so that's all well and good. One question, though, of course, is how is it that the cerebellum does this? What is it about cerebellar organization that allows us to both represent prior experience, represent our actions in the moment, and also adapt to different contexts depending on whether it's language or social interaction or whatnot? So in the cortex, similar very complex behaviors are supported by hierarchical interactions between brain regions. And what hierarchical means in this context is that moving parts build on each other, becoming progressively more and more abstract over time. So just to give you kind of a toy model of what this might look like, we can represent several of these kind of cognitive constructs at a very concrete level. So for example, we can measure stimulus response associations and actions. So if I do this, what happens on the cerebellum? Or if I do this, what happens to behavior? In the domain of language, for example, I can measure a concrete association by saying, by measuring how an individual might respond to a greeting. So if I say hello, what might someone respond in return? We know, though, that actually cognitive constructs and language are more complex than this. And in fact, our setting and our context determines which actions we're going to take. So depending on if we're in a formal or informal setting, we might have different responses in response to a stimulus, like a greeting. And lastly, what we want to do, for example, in the context of conversation or goal-directed actions, depends on our goals. It depends on our prior experiences, our schema of what we've done in the past, our past experiences with a conversational partner, and also our goals for what we want to get out of an interaction. Now, in the cortex, it turns out that different aspects of cognition, from schema to context to more concrete stimulus response associations, are organized in a gradient-like fashion in the prefrontal cortex, moving from very abstract to very concrete. And this reflects the intrinsic organization of the brain. So these are resting state networks of the brain when people are doing nothing. Networks that are involved in very abstract thought are located very rostrally. And as you move caudally, you get, this representation of more concrete networks. And what previous individuals have found is that interactions between these regions is actually what supports this very complex cognition and allows our schema, our past experience, to influence our behaviors in the moment, filtered through the lens of context. Now, what we noticed is that the cerebellum is actually organized intrinsically in a very similar gradient-like manner, moving from very concrete networks towards very abstract networks. And so potentially we thought maybe the cerebellum is organized in a very similar way. And that's exactly what we found. We found that regions of the cerebellum, like right crus 1 and 2, represented very abstract aspects of processing, like schema. And as you moved towards motor regions of cerebellum, representations grew more and more concrete. And when we actually probed these activation patterns, what we found was just like in the prefrontal cortex, activation in these contextual control regions fully mediated the relationship between activations in these schematic regions and concrete regions. So suggesting that context is mediating how we apply our goals to guide our current action in the cerebellum as well. Now, of course, if schematic regions are truly abstract, then what they should help us to do is use our previous behavior to inform behavior in the future. And if concrete regions are really informing these kind of stimulus response associations, then they should be related to what we're doing in the moment. And so what we can do is we can look at behavior relative to times that individuals are in the scanner. And I've kind of glossed over the details of the task in the scanner and how we've done this because it's complex. But if people have questions, I'm happy to go back to that. And what we find is that activation in these very abstract schematic regions is associated with behavior in the future. So an individual's reaction time in the future, but not an individual's reaction time in the moment. The opposite is true of activation patterns in these kind of concrete processing regions. And activation in these contextual processing regions is associated with both behavior in the moment and behavior in the future, positioning these regions to perfectly integrate abstract goals and schema with current actions to inform current actions. Okay, now, if you are a Cerebellar researcher at this point and you submit this for publication, the reviewers are going to come back and say, okay, that's great, but the cerebellum is connected to the cerebral cortex via these reciprocal closed loop circuits. And so how do you know that everything you've seen in the cerebellum, all these interactions in the cerebellum, aren't merely a reflection of what's actually happening in the cerebral cortex? And so to account for this, what we did was we looked at how much of the variance in these prefrontal and parietal regions we could account for and remove from cerebellum before interactions between cerebellar regions started to fall apart. And what we found was that, of course, the cerebellum was vulnerable to the regression of these signals from the cerebral cortex, but not that vulnerable. It took a lot of removal of prefrontal signals before interactions in the cerebellum specifically started to fall apart. On the other hand, what we found was that interactions between these subregions in the prefrontal cortex were very vulnerable from removal of cerebellar signals. So it turned out that these interactions in the prefrontal cortex were more reliant on cerebellar signals than vice versa. What we also found was that, unlike in the cerebral cortex, the amount of cerebellum devoted to this contextual processing was much greater in the cerebellum than in the cerebral cortex. The other kinds of domains showed kind of proportional amounts of cortex devoted to each kind of domain, but contextual processing was much higher in the cerebellum. And so this kind of speaks to maybe what it is that the cerebellum is doing, what it is that the cerebellum is specifically important for, this ability to quickly adapt to changing circumstances based both on prior experience, but also on action in the moment. And we think that this is primarily important for things like cognitive flexibility, the ability to adapt to different circumstances. And cognitive flexibility, we know, is impaired in disorders like autism. In fact, cognitive flexibility are some of the most reported challenges, even more reported than challenges in social interaction in individuals with autism. So something that we're really interested in, actually, is exploring this further, exploring whether interactions between the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex during these kind of tasks and these different representation are represented differently in individuals with autism and neurotypicals, whether these circuits are of different strengths in individuals with autism and neurotypicals, and whether differences in these cerebello-prefrontal circuits are related to challenges adapting to change in autism or cognitive inflexibility, but might also underlie several of the surprising strengths that we see in individuals with autism. For example, enhanced focus, enhanced deliberation, and less susceptibility to contextual distractions in certain contexts. And so this is something that we've been funded to do, and we're really excited to get started on. Okay, so I will start to kind of put together what it is that I've told you today and give you a few take-home messages. So the first is that the cerebellum is a tragically understudied region in cognitive neuroscience, but that several of our studies and those of others have shown that differences in both structure and function of the cerebellum are related both to typical language and cognition and development of these functions, but also to atypical language and cognition. And the second is that in motor behaviors, the cerebellum houses and implements these internal models for sensory motor action. And it's possible that the cerebellum is also doing this for language, and that this may be achieved through hierarchical organization and interactions between subregions in the cerebellum that allow individuals to represent both past behavior, future behavior, and context. And so I want to end with a call to action for people here. And that is to really think about what it is that we might be missing when we fail to account for the cerebellum, not only in our journal covers and figures, but also in our theoretical frameworks and analyses of language and cognition and disorders. And so if you're interested in figuring this out, please contact me. I'm always looking for collaborators, students, staff to tackle this integration of the cerebellum into our frameworks of language and cognition. And so with that, I'll end with my acknowledgements, primarily to the participants and their families that have taken part in all of this research, my collaborators, my funding sources, and I'd be happy to take any sorts of questions.
All right, thanks. Thank you. That was great. So I'll open the floor to questions. I see John has his virtual hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I thought that was a really terrific talk and so clearly presented. I appreciate it. I have sort of I guess a kind of a crude question, which is, given how persuasively you've supported the important roles of the cerebellum, how is it that we've spent so long thinking it was unimportant and thinking, I mean, in medical school, we easily saw the pathology in people with cerebellar motor findings and missed the rest. So is it analogous, do you think, to sort of executive function, where what it's doing is important, but at an abstract level that makes it hard to point your finger at? Or can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think it's really twofold. The first is dogma is incredibly powerful, right? And so we are taught in class and textbooks that the cerebellum is a motor structure. And so when you see activation there, which you do all the time in cognitive tasks, and people have for years, decades, people don't think it might be associated with some sort of motor aspect of the task, or they ignore it. And I've talked to several researchers who say, Oh yeah, in our memory tasks, we always get cerebellum, but we just ignore it, put it in a table, and don't interpret it in the results. The other problem is because of that dogma, in neuroimaging at least, but also in clinical work, people fail to acquire cerebellum at all. They cut it off. They don't acquire it in the field of view that you use for neuroimaging. And so that reinforces, this idea. You say, hey, I've done a whole brain analysis, but you're missing, a lot of what could have been there had you acquired that. And the same is true clinically. Kids who have cerebellar hemorrhages at birth, clinicians might identify those, right? And say, hey, you don't have any motor issues. You are lucky. You're probably okay. And then, decades after, they come in saying, I have trouble reading. I have trouble with language, or my social interaction is, and so yeah, exactly. Thanks. That's a really good question.
Go ahead, Shailesh.
That was a great talk. Very, very informative. So I have one question that's more procedural, and the other question is more kind of abstract. So I'll first start with the abstract question. So one of the things that I really found fascinating in your talk was that cerebellum in some ways alters the communication, if you will, between cortical areas, or activity of different cortical areas. What do you think is other than its role in prediction and sort of online control, what do you think it is really doing? What is the functional significance of that altered connectivity between cortical areas?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly what we're trying to figure out. So some of what I talked about was this kind of internal model theory, these predictive processing theories. Those are taken very heavily from the motor literature, right? They come from this idea that, hey, cerebellar cytoarchitecture is the same, must be doing the same thing, right? Those are really actually have been hard to prove because, what is the signal that you're getting from cortex when you're making a linguistic prediction? Is it a word? Is it a sound? Is it a sentence? Is it a paragraph? What is the time scale? I mean, it's really difficult. Same with social interaction. Is it a gesture? Is it an eye gaze? So it's really difficult to kind of try and figure out what the first of all, what the signal to cerebellum even is, and then at what time scale that's happening, right? So that's hard, and it's hard because models that you want to use, like mice, they don't talk in the same way, and so it starts to become a little difficult. So that's one thing about the model itself. And the other question is, like, a lot of what I've shown here is that, okay, yeah, cerebellum's also coactive on these tasks that the cerebral cortex is in. So some of the work is just saying, hey, I'm here too, cerebellum's here too. Those studies don't really give us any specific knowledge on what the cerebellum is doing more or less to cortex. For that, I think we need more neuromodulation studies, patient studies who have maybe some sort of disconnection, some cysts, and that's the kind of stuff that we're working on right now.
That is really cool. I'm more interested in it from a learning perspective.
Yeah.
So that's why it was fascinating. And the second question was, you did demonstrate some TDCS studies, and most of these studies, so what was maybe I missed it, but did you mention what polarity and was this, and is it like the cortex, or at least so we think in the cortex, is polarity dependent, and does the same sort of polarity specific effects, are those similarly reflected in the cerebellum as well, or no?
Yeah, so this is a crazy field, right? So yes, the effects seem to be polarity dependent, but what few people catch during the talk, and I kind of gloss over often, but I think is very interesting actually, is that even the same polarity in different domains in the same region can have opposite effects on behavior. So anodal TDCS to right crest 1 has largely good effects on language behavior. People get better. We've shown this a few times. The networks get stronger. Anodal TDCS during that social learning task really impaired participants' ability to learn on the task. So no idea, right, why that might be. I think in the cortex, things are similar, right? I saw a talk recently where someone was saying, oh, look, we did TDCS, or TMS. There was no cognitive effect on anything other than X. And I'm like, we don't usually test people on math and reading and writing and every cognitive domain when we do something like TMS. So it's unclear when you mess with the system, either for better or worse, what you lose in return, whether, so yes, the effects are polarity specific, but there's some sort of domain by task, by polarity, interaction, by region.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. That was a great talk.
Okay, vas-y, Simon.
So thank you for the talk. It was a really nice talk. I really appreciate the presentation. I have a question. When you look at the activation of the cerebellum and especially the semantic activation, I was wondering, did you already look at like the representation of different word categories, like, I don't know, action verbs? No, you didn't.
No, we haven't. So people have done that in the past to say, okay, maybe it's just that the cerebellum's really involved in representing primarily things that are related to action verbs, tools. So that doesn't turn out to be the case. And people have found that in the past. There was a recent study that was published in Journal of Neuroscience. The first author is Amanda Labelle, and her work comes out of Alexander Huth's lab, who is at UT Austin. And they've shown that actually when you do these kind of voxel-wise encoding models, so kind of look at all the possible features of a naturalistic language signal, like a story that participants hear in the scanner, and kind of map on these features to different, voxels in the brain and cerebellum, that really a majority of the cerebellum is involved in some sort of semantic representation. And so some of the projects that we have planned now are to kind of go through and look within language regions of the cerebellum and ask exactly what it is that you're seeing. In cortex, you get maybe distinctions depending on the type of verb, the type of noun, the type of place, part of speech, syntactical processing versus phonology versus semantics. That kind of very specific analysis hasn't really been done in cerebellum. And so that's something that we're working on doing, and also doing it in patient populations who have disturbances of language, to see how that might.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, go ahead, Erin.
Oh, where'd you go?
Thanks, you did a great talk. I just had sort of a kind of technical question, partially in follow-up to what Shailesh had asked. So in your TDS study, I noticed that you had looked at sort of shown a differential effect depending on whether you're stimulating the more language areas or the more motor areas. And I was just curious, like, how focal you can actually get your TDS to differentiate between those regions in the cerebellum.
Yeah. So when I was doing this study, I thought it was absurd and that it wouldn't be very focal at all. The pads are like enormous. My PI, my graduate advisor always says it's like hitting the head with a hammer. But then when you look at the neuroimaging data, it's actually quite convincing. So if you look at functional connectivity, so how correlated activation in a cerebellar region is with activation in the cerebral cortex, what you find is that you can change that functional connectivity around crust 1, crust 2, but that you're not changing connectivity with like motor circuits, which are pretty close, right, adjacent, both in the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. So I was actually convinced that you can get relatively focal. And I've actually talked to other people here at UT Dallas who have found that some of their techniques like TMS, which is very focal, they actually see less of an effect on certain tasks. And so there's a question in my mind about whether focal is great for basic science, but whether maybe you do need a population kind of effect to see differences in these more complex tasks. Whether there's some sort of compensation that's happening at the more focal kind of types of stimulation. So yes, so I don't know if that's very satisfying, but I'm not satisfied either.
Can I follow up on that? Because
Yeah.
this is really exciting, and but then when you say that this focal activation in imaging, is it related to, is it in conjunction with a task? So what I'm trying to understand is the effects of cerebellar stimulation on these circuits. Are they task dependent? And so do you have a task that's like more cognitive? You're, blasting this whole area. And now the task is sort of driving a certain, segment of this connectivity. Is it that what shows up?
Yes. So I can answer your question with what we've done and then what we should do to answer that question. What we've done is on a language task, right, that requires some sort of predictive and non-predictive component. When you TDCS cognitive regions of the cerebellum, you get increased activation in language-specific regions. But of course, you're doing a language task, right? It's related to the TDCS. And that activation is more pronounced when prediction is necessary. So kind of in line with this idea of the state dependencies in addition to the task. What we should do is a matrix of, right, like predictive versus non-predictive. If you think that that's kind of this core function of cerebellum, and like motor, cognitive, perceptual, blah, 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 by a third dimension of the matrix, which is position, motor versus cognitive, right? And that would kind of answer your question about, is it state dependent? Is it task dependent? Is it position dependent? Right. But no one's, you can kind of piece that together from what other people have done, but no one has that kind of internal control. We're saying the same participant. We did the motor position for 75 tasks, all of which included this kind of basic conceptual manipulation, and then the cognitive position. We've done a little bit of that for, resting state, this and that, but nothing comprehensive.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Erica.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so yeah, I'm a convert. This is great. Really nice, impressive body of work. And I just was, and this is maybe a kind of a general question for the therapists on the call, but so are there larger implications for people, for example, that have just the cerebellar stroke that are underserved then in different kind of treatment domains? And is there a way to, I guess, over time, just kind of measure that? And I could see like kind of contribution to like a big Cochrane review of stroke, so are they underserved, and what are they under, not referred for speech language therapy, for example, when they should be, based on
Definitely. That is a great question. I think they're definitely underserved. I think they're under-identified. Like we know what the motor syndrome is following stroke to motor regions, even for speech language pathology, we know, right, what we're looking for. It's less well characterized for cognitive strokes. And obviously it differs depending on regions. If you have a stroke, and I've seen this, a woman that we saw who, had a stroke to a very specific region in the cerebellum that is related to executive function. She said one day she woke up, she wasn't able to get her thoughts organized to get to work anymore. She was a CEO. She had to leave her job. Eventually, she got diagnosed as being autistic because some doctor said, oh, yeah, this is a symptom of autistic burnout. You were autistic all this time. You didn't know it. And we scanned her and we found a really focal cerebellar stroke. And we alerted her, and she instantly went on medication to prevent future kind of strokes. So yes, I think it can help treatment. It can help kind of focus on, is it like a praxis issue? Is it a conceptual issue? Is it a, whatever. I'll also give you like a personal example, which is I'm not a doctor, I'm not a clinician. I routinely get emails from parents saying, my kid has a cerebellar cyst, a stroke, or this or that. No one knows what to do with them. They get kind of tossed around. They say, oh, you're going to be fine. Oh, this is no one has really, pulled these people together and said, hey, cognitive cerebellar issues are a thing. And here's how clinicians should at least be able to say, here's what you can maybe expect. You might have some difficulties with, phonemic XYZ. You might have, but there's not a lot of work done on that. Yeah.
In lesion studies, like that we conduct here, I don't know, because I don't really run those kind of studies, but don't we usually exclude people that also have cerebellar damage? We just go for pure cortical or subcortical. So excluding these people from research.
And what's interesting too about that is, it's unclear what the primary deficit is sometimes. So these areas are reciprocally connected. In developing infants, you see atrophy in the connected regions. So if you have a primary cerebellar bleed or stroke, you see atrophy in the connected cortical regions. And so if the regions are connected, it's over time, maybe over 30 years, you might see differences in the cerebellum and you don't know where they came from, if they were first, if they were last. Really, we should probably be looking at this as a circuit rather than in any sort of isolation ever. But yeah,
Thank you.
Oh, you're on mute, John.
I just wanted to ask one more question, which occurs to me that I work primarily with a traumatic brain injury population, and they don't very often have focal cerebellar cortex damage, but they very frequently have diffuse axonal injury impacting the input and output fiber pathways. And of course, they have often a lot of ataxic symptoms related to that as well. But do you have any thoughts about implications of white matter disconnection to and from the cerebellum? Is that something we should also be thinking about from a cognitive perspective?
Definitely. There's plenty of studies that have looked at white matter connections, peduncles, fiber density, and related it to cognition. There was a recent study of a grad student at MIT in the lab that I did my postdoc in, who he had a huge sample, like 1,000 children, with dyslexia. And one of the only, and he did, white matter analyses looking at tracks. One of the only significant regions that was correlated with reading ability in these dyslexic kids was cerebellar tracks.
It's interesting, yeah, because in TBI, a lot of the clinical deficits arguably could be related to context insensitivity, failure to predict. They're often sort of subtle social and social linguistic errors. So, and we know that these types of white matter disruptions are quite prominent. It'd be interesting to do just a case series looking at how much the contribution of white matter damage there, predicts various kinds of social deficits.
Right. Yes. And I think, the nice thing about the cerebellum is, it's getting hotter right now, but it's kind of a wide open field. There's so much to do, and you can go back to your old data and look at it again. And so, there's so much out there that we can use to answer these questions. And so it's great. It's exciting.
All right. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so I think we'll close up shop there. I want to thank Anila again for this great seminar. And if anybody has any further questions, I'm sure you can reach out to her directly. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.